All right. There's been some discussion online about two kingdom theology or the doctrine of the twofold kingdoms. And I thought that it would be helpful for me to do a little bit of a background and also kind of framing discussion of the issue. And because I think many people don't really know, this has been one of my frustrations over the last year, actually longer than that, for several years, that two kingdoms theology has been essentially owned by a crowd of people who don't really even have the historic view of two kingdom theology. And so I think it's good to understand the framing, how these things are framed that give them the advantage over opponents and also over people who would hold to a historic two kingdom theology. So just jumping right into it, I think what's happened over the last 20 years in the reform circles is there was a recovery of this idea of twofold kingdom or two kingdom theology. And this recovery, you could see the big names would be David Van Drunen, Michael Horton, Daryl Hart, and Scott Clark, and others too. I forget their names. One guy converted Rome. I forget his name now. But there was this kind of recovery, the idea of dual citizenship, the idea of two kingdoms, and they recovered it from, I mean, they recovered the general idea of it, I from what I understand. um and they oriented themselves in opposition to neo-Calvinists, namely transformationalists, and also the theonomists and the postmillennialists and the reconstructionists and all that. So a lot of the kind of trendy, more assertive reformed political theology of the 20th century was opposed by this resurgence of a two kingdom theology. And the person who's probably written the most about this in terms of print in printed form, I'd say, is probably David Van Drunen. Um, the effect of all that has been that the sides in the debate, the different sides of reformed political theology, really has, like, maybe you could say two, like, three camps, is three general camps. You have the two kingdom folks, and then you have the kind of theonomic post-mill crowd, kind of followers of Bonson and Rushdoony. And then you have the more neo-Calvinist types, and there's some overlap between, I'd say, theonomic reconstructionists and neo-Calvinists, but there are some people who would be more like Kuyperian. They tend to be a little more liberal politically. But anyway, those would kind of be the different camps. And so now when you go to choose or decide upon your political theology, if you want to have Christian political order, you want to have Christian laws, if you want to have laws based upon biblical revelation, and that would be distinctively Christian, that sort of thing, you would have to choose that Reconstructionist, theonomic, post mill wing. You'd probably be a fan of Doug Wilson and that kind of crowd. The neo Calvinists are an interesting bunch because they kind of believe that, but then they're also politically liberal. I won't talk much about them. That would be like the cultural liturgy, like J.K. Smith would be kind of a somewhat theologically liberal, or politically liberal and probably theologically a little liberal, neo Calvinist on the transformational side. Um, okay, you have those sides, and then the other option is you could be a two kingdom guy. And that's the option you take if you want to be semi-pietist. They wouldn't like being described that way, but you don't want to have a Christian nation. You don't want Christian laws. You want to think of Christian as the things you do in the church institutional sphere, and you don't want to carry that. You don't want to make anything Christian outside of that. Then that would be your two kingdom camp. Okay. And so to this day, in fact, just last Sunday, someone I was talking to in church said 2K, and they meant that. They meant that there are no Christian magistrates, that you don't have any distinctively Christian laws. Christians don't seek power in order to bring about a Christian political order. You shouldn't do any of that stuff. So, but they're not utterly pietists such that they would ban, they would be okay with banning gay marriage. They'd be okay with banning like abortion. So they're not like complete pietists and say disengage. They just don't want anything Christian. Now that framing is a little very odd, and it's ahistorical, precisely for the fact that most of the reformers and post-Reformation theologians were a form of two kingdoms. I mean, so Calvin is very clearly the idea of two kingdoms is in a way you can see that in Calvin, and people later on kind of want to talk about a twofold kingdom is they don't want to kind of make a separation of the kingdom. And so today people use both, and then someone says it's better to have twofold and whatever. That that's a discussion to have. I think either way, if you know what you mean, it's not a big deal, but probably it's more precise to say twofold kingdom because there's one king, one kingdom, but that the reign of that kingdom is twofold and distinct. And that's what Calvin meant. He didn't mean two kingdoms. He meant one kingdom, twofold modes of reign and all that. So we can get into that maybe a little later. But the point being that that framing is odd, that when you go to a reform seminary and you have to decide upon these options, that somehow the semi pietist, the natural law side is the one that doesn't want Christian nations. That's very odd historically. If Calvin and Richard Hooker, of course, I mean, Richard Hooker wanted to give the king a lot of powers with regard to, or retain the king, retain the powers related to ecclesial matters. And that's kind of a distinctive Anglican two kingdoms. And then you have later on, you have Rutherford, Samuel Rutherford disputing the Erastian or Richard Hooker's conception of two kingdoms, and actually is asserting not what you'd find in 20th century thinking, but actually another form of two kingdoms. So the dispute over twofold kingdoms for the centuries, at least everything that I'm aware of, and I can cite a lot of different sources on this. Um, the dispute wasn't whether or not there is this sort of twofoldness of the kingdom or the two kingdoms. It was over the nature of that. So, like the dispute between Hooker and Rutherford. I mean, Hooker already died by the time Rutherford was writing, but the dispute was over the nature of the two kingdoms, such that like Rutherford wanted to extend that kingdom more to the actual institution outward element. So whereas Hooker wanted to distinguish more inward outward. So there's like the outward, like temporal jurisdiction, and then there's the spiritual jurisdiction. So it's more of an invisible, visible divide. And what this allowed him to do is then to say, well, the civil ruler has, because his power extends to outward things, he can order the church in ways, in more outward ways. So like in other words, like the institutional church, the outward form of the institutional church, he could be in a sense the head of the church. I know they Anglicans moved away from that conception. And but anyway, that's the kind of idea that the civil ruler having power over external things can now enact external things related to the church. Rutherford said, no, the visible church is the kingdom of Christ, and that is so thus it's separate from the civil power, and so it's pastor's job to then govern that. So that this would mean something like the civil ruler cannot um, enact ceremonies. He cannot install the pastor that he wants. But at the same time, Rutherford would acknowledge it that he can punish heresy and punish blasphemy and all that. Anyway, the point is that the dispute wasn't whether there's two kingdoms, but the nature of each for the long time. And I've seen no evidence that the twofoldness of the kingdom was rejected or disputed among anyone in the Reform side until the 20th century. So all that being said, the reason I say that is that it's odd then to show up in the 90s and 2000s and today and hear some guy affirm or talk about two kingdoms as if the civil rulers have can't be Christian, then that we can't have laws that are Christian, and that Christians can't seek a sort of Christian ordering of society. It's very odd. But why is that? Well, I think it's to the advantage of the two kingdom people to position themselves against a crowd that is not clearly historical in the Reformed tradition. So there is a sort of revival of let's retrieve the text, let's retrieve Protestantism, some of these Protestant old texts that have been kind of buried and lost. Well, it just happens to be the case, and it's true, that you'll see forms of natural law and two kingdoms within the Reformed tradition. So these guys can say we're two kingdoms, we're actually consistent with our tradition, whereas theonomy is not actually consistent with the tradition as it's described. That and then there's like the post mill, like to the extent people are post mill, I don't think that's as much disputed. But there was a out of focus there. Should I do that? It gets me back focused. Anyway, I'll probably come back. Um, so, but anyway, they position themselves against a camp that is harder to show that theonomy as conceived in the 20th century is found. I mean, you could say it's a development and all that, but it's found in that, or the rejection of natural law is that found in the Reformed tradition. I mean, and it's not. So these guys like Van Drunen can like write a thick book that shows natural law and two kingdom theology throughout the Reformed tradition, and somehow in the end say I'm two kingdoms, and yet reject the idea of a Christian public or civil order, reject the idea of Christian civil magistrates. Um, but that's the framing. That's how it is. That's how, and it's good for the two, like I said, it's good for the two kingdom side, because then they could say, look at these guys who are outside the tradition. We're part of the tradition. Again, and it's funny because like Scott Clark seems to be even worse than Van Drunen, though probably maybe not. I heard a doozy about Van Drunen talking about Sabbath laws. If you have a Mars colony, a colony on Mars, and they're all Christian, can you have a Sabbath law? And he basically said no. So, but anyway, it's funny. Like you look at Scott Clark's website, and when he talks about the twofold kingdom, he lists all these guys who've affirmed twofold kingdom. All those same people also affirmed Christian civil order. They also affirmed punishing blasphemy. They also, affirmed public support for the churches. They also, most of them affirmed punishing heretics if it's prudent and wise. So it's very odd. It should strike us as weird that the people consistent with the tradition, so they say, are the most inconsistent when it comes to actual Christian laws and Christian civil order, the actual application of the two kingdoms. That should strike us as odd, but it surprisingly doesn't. And again, it's to their advantage. So there has been, this is one of the other things that's been frustrating. There has been pushback against Daryl Hart and Scott Clark and Van Drunen and Horton, all these guys that I would say was probably like 10, maybe 10, 15, started maybe 10, 15 years ago, largely among young people who were in seminary or just gotten out of seminary. They had read Calvin and they realized, wait, something's not right if Scott Clark is saying he's two kingdoms, but he's essentially a pietist. Something doesn't make sense when Calvin in his preface to his Institutes is calling on the king to enact true religion in France. So something's not right. And they looked into it. So the people here would be people like Stephen Wedgeworth, Peter Escalante, Brad Littlejohn. Uh, who else would be in that camp? People like Eric Hutchinson. Probably think of other names as I go through this, but those would be the kind of people. Probably the bigger names would be Littlejohn, Wedgeworth, and Peter Escalante. Peter Escalante is kind of fallen off the map in a way, but Wedgeworth and Littlejohn are still around. They started pushing back against this. This is partly from Brad's study of Richard Hooker, and then it seemed that Wedgeworth was studying a lot of Calvin, and so they eventually found each other online, and they started the Calvinist International, which and then Brad started Davenant Trust, which became the Davin Institute. Anyway, they put out, there was an early kind of like dust up between people like Hart and Scott Clark versus these guys. Basically, again, the Davenant people saying you guys have it half right and half wrong. And so that started, and there was a lot of uh, back and forth early on. This was before that I really kind of joined that crowd in a way, as sort of joined that crowd. Because because I was somewhat of a neo Calvinist. I was active duty army in 2010 when I started seeing these things, and mainly because I thought that was the the only way to make sense of our existence in a world that is political and how do we engage in Christian politics. I thought neo Calvinism was it. I was never like a theonomist, um, but then I encountered these guys, and my initial response was, "Hey, I'm not supposed to like two kingdom theology." And then I started reading their stuff. I'm like, wait, this actually one is not what I thought it was. Two, it actually coheres with Reformed theology and the opposite what I believed before. I don't think neo Calvinism coheres with it. That's why it's neo. It's new in relation to the older tradition. And so I realized that no way, this is a consistent Reformed theology. It's biblical. It affirms the earthly and heavenly aspects of life. It affirms temporal, eternal, political order versus ecclesial. Everything kind of made sense when I read these guys. So anyway, they wrote for a long time on this stuff, and even though a few people noticed within the actual text of like someone like Van Drunen, he doesn't deal with it. It's actually incredibly frustrating. His most latest book is The Politics After Christendom. He gave Brad Littlejohn a single footnote, and that's it, and it was just it was almost like dismissal. So here's a guy who's written about how he's consistent with reformers. Here's a bunch of very smart, I'd say smarter people, who say, "No, you're wrong. You have it half right, but you are actually extremely modern and innovative in this key area." And it's just dismissed. Now, I don't want to like say motivations, but the effect, at least, is to make it easier for your side. If you don't acknowledge the fact that your two kingdom theology is innovative, that it is modern, that it is actually opposed in very specific ways to the older tradition, then you can position yourself as on the side of the tradition versus the 20th century innovators, like the Reconstructionists and the Theonomists and those guys. And so rhetorically, it works out really well for them. But it's been very frustrating. And this goes to which I would call on people to not think this way, to think two kingdom theology. Okay, there's a modern version that wants us to be like a second table onlyist. In some sense, civil government is not cognizant of divine things. That's essentially what they're claiming, that they can do commandment 5 through 10, 1 through 4, the first table. They're just not cognizant of those things. I don't know. I don't understand how that works. Because if you can be cognizant of the law, you can be cognizant of the lawgiver. And if you're cognizant of the lawgiver, then you can be cognizant of the first table. So I don't know, because these all flow like the first table flows from the very fact of God's existence. It's not like this arbitrary, like we're not, you know, radical nominalists and alchemists who think that 1 through 4 is just a optional extra that we get to worship God. No, it's like God exists. We're rational creatures. We 1 through 4 actually flows rationally, necessarily, logically from those two facts that God exists and we're rational moral creatures. Anyway, and so it doesn't make any like the second table onyism makes no logical sense. If you affirm the second table, you must by logical necessity affirm the first, or at least be cognizant of it. And if government's cognizant of it, if they can know that you should worship the one true God, if they know that you should worship God rightly, if they know that you should honor the things of God, and they know that you ought to devote a day of worship, well, then the government can act for people to do that, right? So anyway, you can get on, but where was I before I got on that tangent? Oh, I'll just encourage people to realize that there is a classical conception of two kingdom theology. Even within that classical conception, there's different views and conceptions of it. From I think there is a difference between Presbyterian and kind of a Richard Hooker Anglican version. And it's reflected in the fact, and like in the Westminster Confession of Faith, they not only do they distinguish between like the kingdom of power, grace, and glory, it says very clearly that the visible church is the kingdom of Christ, which I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think Richard Hooker would want to say that. And if he did say that, he'd want to qualify it and make sure you realize that, wait, it's still outward and therefore under some regulation by the civil power. But anyway, the point being is that there is a classical and then there's a modern conception, and the modern conception should should not be the only. I mean, should not claim it. I mean, I don't think they should claim it because I think they're inconsistent, but they should not be claimed to be the only followers of that tradition. And I would just also suggest that if that you should look into the older conception of two kingdoms, and I think it's consistent with more Reformed theology. And and I like in just as an aside, my opinion is that a lot of the 20th century developments or innovations were largely entirely unnecessary. And they would have been unnecessary. They would have realized that they're unnecessary if they fully understood the implications of classical Protestant political thought. But instead, I suspect that they didn't. People are not going to like me saying that, but I suspect that they didn't, and so they saw a need. They needed some way to reinvigorate reformed political action, and to do that was to it made sense at the time to become very biblicist, to become kind of theonomic, to reject natural law because people seem to be opposing this natural law in the secular world and all that. So anyway, so that is my, I guess, brief video on that subject. Oh, and I was going to bring up this. Let me see if I can bring this up here. Um, yeah. So this is Benjamin. I think it's Glacier. I've never talked to him in person. But yeah. So he says Wolf is neither Kuyperian or Reconstructionist. Theonomic. He is all millennial. But they only know how to argue against those two categories, which is why they keep missing the point. So what's happening, just to talk about myself, and this has happened from the very beginning of when my book came out, is there was an assumption that I was post-mill, theonomic, dominionist, presuppositionalist, stuff like that. Everyone thought that I was a certain crowd because the framing of the issue forced them into thinking like that. Well, he can't be two kingdoms because he wants to have a Christian nation. He wants this thing called Christian nationalism. Must be this other stuff. And so people are missing. This is just, Benjamin's just pointing this out. And then you have David Talcott. Let's see if I can. Oops. Um, Folks have missed the fact that Wolves 2 is not Kuyperian. This is why contemporary Rattle 2K guys keep pointing their anti-Kuyperian guns at him and coming up totally empty. Wolf has a stored 2K picture laid out in spades. So what David's saying, same thing as Benjamin's saying. This is in response to Alan Strange, and I don't know if he mentioned me in this book. I haven't picked it up, but I have talked to Alan, so I don't know if this book might have already been kind of with the editor by the time we talked, and he cared about what I thought. Um, but yeah, this is kind of an example. This is a good example of the framing of the dispute, because uh, if you think that because among the theonomic reconstructionist post-mill type of people, the church is not only, I mean, it is political, but that, and also Christian politics is basically something the institution kind of does, organizes, instructs upon, and then people get their marching orders going out of the church. It's almost as if that if you're going to do Christian politics, you need to kind of take the lead from what your pastor says, and then you go forth and conquer. It's as if there's like it's like the instituted church is like the hub through which Christian politics happens in the world. And that's kind of like your activity, your kingdom work in the world is you Christianizing things. That's neo-Calvinist. That's I guess Kuyperian. I don't know if Kuyper directly said that, but that's kind of the orientation. What Alan Strange is saying is that, well, no, there's a spiritual mission of the church that's oriented towards spiritual higher things. So instead of seeing the church as heaven coming down to earth from which we then do our kingdom work out in the world, it's more of a it's principally a heavenly orientation to the higher things, to heavenly life. So it's the feeding the soul for a higher future life. That's not to say it doesn't have any practical effects or there's no instructions on your practical life or even on politics, but that the principal role is spiritual. It's for your soul, and your soul is bound not for this temporal world, but for the eternal state, which includes this world, but in a higher, elevated, glorified state. So it's like, in other words, like you being a good, like the, like you establishing Christian magistracy or like a civil law is not itself the kingdom, but it points and contributes to that kingdom. So, but my point is that like that, even if you want to affirm the spirituality of the church, which I generally kind of would affirm as well, that is, I think the church should mainly focus upon your soul and your future life and future state. That is the church as the institution, the pastor. Um, but even if you affirm that, that doesn't exclude you going into the world and saying, I want to Christianize these institutions, not to immanentize the eschaton, not to bring heaven down to earth, not to make the temporal eternal, but to order the temporal to the higher. And it's the same thing we do as a family. Like in heavenly life, there's appears to be no marriage and having children. And yet we get married and have children. What do? We orient that in part that whole family towards higher things. The same thing would be for the nation, for the civil laws, for institutions. You'd order those things to the higher things, but in doing so, you're not immanentizing the eschaton. You're not bringing heaven down to earth. You're not making the temporal eternal. You're not, I don't know, sacredizing the profane or whatever you want to call it. Um, so that's my point. I know people watching this won't agree with all that what I'm saying, but the point is logically, according to the classical conception of two kingdoms, what Alan Strange is saying here does not prevent any of that. It does not prevent Christian magistrates. It does not prevent Christian civil law. It does not prevent Christian public order. But yet, if you have the framing of today, modern 2K versus theonomic post mill or whatever, and or modern 2K versus Kuyperian neo Calvinism, then that critique does work. And that's why they do things like this, because in their mind, they're critiquing that when they are actually missing the point in relation to classical two kingdoms. Right. And so this is why, yeah, this is why it's important to understand. Because I think even in like Alan Strange's mind, I think in Van Druen's mind, I think all these guys in their minds, the spirituality of the church concept, they actually think that is a defeater of Christian political order. Like I think they actually think that. And really it's a fault of the framing that's gone back for decades that needs to be critiqued, and it has been critiqued. So I mean, I don't think Van Drunen pays attention to me, but if I would just ask him, and I would ask Scott Clark and Daryl Hart and all this, to take seriously the fact that there are people who affirm the historic two kingdoms position, and they affirm it as everyone affirmed it until recently. And not just simply kind of dismiss that. What's fascinating, it really is I'm kind of rambling now, I'm sorry. But they're like it's fascinating, like Scott Clark. I mean, I don't really respect Scott Clark much. I think Van Drunen is mistaken, but I think he's a decent guy. Daryl Hart, I think, is a good scholar. I think he knows he's wrong, but I'll leave it at that. Um, but these guys should just be willing to admit that they have an innovative version of it. They should be willing to, and also they should be willing to engage respectfully people who affirm the same position as Calvin, the same position as Turretin, the same position as Althusius and Junius, and if you know. So it's one of these strange things when of all the like almost every negative review almost like dismisses things that I said, and most of those things that I've said in the book are just basic things that everyone said until recently. So if you're going to dismiss me and say, "How could he believe that?" Well, Calvin said it, Thusius said it, Turretin said it, Junius said it, Zanke said it, Vermigli said it, Beza said it, Bootser said it. They all said it. And you're just gonna like, oh yeah, Wolf said it, so it's gone. But all right, so don't do that. All right, that's really all. I guess that's 30 minutes. That's the shortest video I've done so far. Maybe another video I'd talk more about what two kingdom theology is. You guys are like, what are you talking about? I'll do that in a different video. But I just want to talk about the framing of it. Framing should be better. Don't let these people claim the theology that they don't actually affirm, or at least open it up a bit. Make there more than one side. There's the modernist two kingdoms, there's a classical two kingdoms, and there's the theonomic people and the neo-Calvinist people. And really at this point, I mean, at this point, and the way things are at this point, we should probably the classical 2K guys should probably get along with the theonomic side. Um, yeah, well, one of the interesting things I keep going on, I'm dying. But one of the interesting things is the classical 2K side has morphed into essentially the Christian nationalists. So me and then some other people online are affirm 2K, and the the old classical 2K guys, they don't talk about it anymore. It's kind of strange. I mean, I haven't seen Wedgwood talk about it in years. Brad Littlejohn, like they did some kind of debates and stuff, but I haven't seen him talk about it much. I don't see anything coming out of David Institute about it. So it's interesting that they no longer talk about it anymore. I don't really exactly know why, but maybe they're just tired and bored of it. But anyway, we'll just leave it that. And so thanks for watching, and until next time.